She was just a maid working hard to make ends meet. But in one moment, everything changed. A millionaire's challenge, harmless at first, soon turned into a life-altering decision. What he didn't know was that she was about to reveal something that would shatter his world and force him to confront a truth he'd been running from. The tension was thick, the stakes higher than he could imagine. But what happened next wasn't just about a wager. It was a fight against a system that's been in place for far too long. Are we really as equal as we claim to be? This is her story, and it's one we must never ignore. Before we dive into this shocking story, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on more eye-opening tales. Now, let's begin. Maria had always been a quiet, unassuming woman. She didn't ask for much from life. She didn't expect anything extraordinary. Her life was simple, one that revolved around long, exhausting hours of work and quiet evenings alone in her small, rented apartment. But it wasn't just the ordinary nature of her life that made her who she was. It was the resilience that had been forged through years of hardship. For years, Maria had worked for the Donovan family, cleaning their mansion, making their lives comfortable, and remaining as invisible as possible. She'd scrubbed floors, dusted shelves, and polished silverware without ever once thinking that she could have something better, something more. She was used to being overlooked, used to the subtle dismissals that came with her role. To the world, she was just a maid, a nobody. But to Maria, that was just a title, a way to survive. She never let it define her, even when it seemed to define everyone else around her. Her job was grueling. The mansion was massive, with countless rooms to maintain and always more to be done. But she had grown accustomed to the endless routine. It was her life, and it paid the bills. It kept a roof over her head, even if it wasn't much. The family she worked for, the Donovans, were wealthy and powerful. Mr. Donovan, a businessman with an air of arrogance and superiority, had built his fortune off the backs of people like Maria. He never saw her as anything more than a tool, something to be used and discarded when it was no longer needed. She had long accepted that this was how the world worked. Maria was used to the way they treated her. She was always polite, always professional, never causing a scene or questioning their behavior. It was easier that way, less complicated. But it was on one particular afternoon that something changed. The air in the mansion seemed to crackle with tension, a quiet storm that Maria couldn't quite place. She was cleaning the grand staircase when she overheard a conversation between Mr. Donovan and some of his business associates. The laughter rang out first, loud and mocking, echoing down the hallway. Maria didn't look up, didn't stop scrubbing the railing. She had learned long ago that pretending not to hear was often the best choice. But this time, something about the conversation made her pause. One of the guests, a tall man with a neatly pressed suit, was speaking in a voice dripping with condescension. "Maybe she should learn to speak better English," he said, as if the words were casual, as if it was a joke. Maria's stomach turned. She had heard these comments before, had grown used to the occasional slip of prejudice, but it always stung. Always. She felt a tightness in her chest. She had worked with Mr. Donovan's family for years. She knew the system they operated in, the way they treated her and the others who worked beneath them. It was always the same, no respect, no acknowledgement of her humanity. Just orders, just the expectation that she would serve without question. But this time, it was different. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the tone of the man's voice or the dismissive way he spoke about her, as if she were invisible. But something inside Maria snapped. She stood still for a moment, her hands clenched tightly around the cloth she was using to clean the railing. She wanted to say something, wanted to shout at them for their ignorance and their cruelty. But she didn't. She knew what would happen if she did. She'd be fired, humiliated, tossed out on the streets. That was how things worked for people like her, but the anger continued to burn inside her. As the conversation died down, Mr. Donovan's voice came into focus. He chuckled at something one of his guests said, then added, "She's just here to clean. Why would she need to speak properly?" The words cut through the air like a knife, and Maria felt the weight of them. She had always been so careful to remain invisible. She had always kept her head down, done her work, and stayed out of their way. But that evening, as she heard those words, something inside her snapped. She couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't stay silent. Her mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. The words rang in her ears, but they also fueled something deeper, a quiet defiance. Maria had spent years in silence, accepting the way things were. She had always been the quiet, invisible worker. But as she stood there on the staircase, listening to the laughter and the mocking, she realized that she didn't have to be invisible anymore. She didn't have to accept this. Not anymore. The decision was quick, almost instinctual. She knew what she had to do. Later that evening, as the Donovan family dined in their lavish dining room, Maria found herself in a position she never thought she'd be in. She was asked to prepare a guest room for one of Mr. Donovan's colleagues, a routine task she had done countless times before. But this time, something was different. As she entered the room with a fresh set of linens, she spotted something out of place. On the polished mahogany desk was an envelope, an official-looking envelope marked with the words "Important, for the Donovans only." It was out of place, casually tossed aside as if it didn't matter. But Maria's curiosity gnawed at her. She had seen the way Mr. Donovan had acted, the way he carried himself, and she knew that the family's wealth and power weren't built on kindness or fairness. They were built on something darker, something Maria had always known but never dared to investigate. Her hands trembled as she reached for the envelope. She knew it wasn't her place to open it, but she couldn't resist. As she pulled it open, a letter fell out, a letter from the immigration office detailing an ongoing investigation into Mr. Donovan's business practices. The letter confirmed what Maria had suspected all along. The Donovans were using illegal labor, exploiting undocumented workers for cheap labor. Her heart raced as she scanned the letter. This was the evidence she needed. This was what could bring everything to light, what could expose the truth about Mr. Donovan and his corrupt empire. She could feel the weight of the information in her hands, but as much as she wanted to destroy it, to burn it and forget about it, Maria knew she couldn't. The truth had found her, and there was no turning back. Just as Maria was about to return the letter to its envelope, she heard footsteps approaching, quick and deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat. Mr. Donovan was coming. She quickly shoved the letter back into the envelope, her hands shaking. Before she could step away from the desk, the door to the room swung open. Maria froze. "Maria," Mr. Donovan said, his voice cold, sharp. "What are you doing in here?" She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel her pulse in her throat, could feel the heat of his gaze on her. She tried to speak, but no words came out. All she could think about was the letter, hidden in her hand, the truth that could change everything. In that moment, she realized she had a choice to make. She could pretend nothing had happened, pretend she hadn't seen the letter. She could continue to live her life in the shadows, doing what she was told. Or she could expose the truth. She could stand up, confront Mr. Donovan, and risk everything. The question hung in the air. Would she do it? Would she take the risk? But before she could answer her own question, Mr. Donovan's voice sliced through the silence. "I asked you a question, Maria," he said, stepping closer. In that moment, Maria knew her life was about to change forever. The tension in the room was palpable. Maria stood there, frozen for a moment, her mind racing, trying to come to terms with what was happening. Mr. Donovan's sharp gaze bore into her, and her heart pounded in her chest. She had been caught, and she knew it. She had seen something she shouldn't have, something that could bring down the entire empire of lies Mr. Donovan had built. She had expected this moment, the confrontation, the suspicion. But now that it was here, Maria didn't know what to say. She could feel the sweat beading on the back of her neck, the silence stretching out between them. What was she supposed to do? What could she say? Mr. Donovan stepped closer, his presence overpowering, filling the room with an air of authority that Maria had always been forced to bow down to. His eyes flickered over the desk, the fresh linens she had placed neatly on the bed, and then back to her, his expression hardening as he took in her stillness. "I asked you what you're doing in here," he repeated, his voice rising with barely contained anger. Maria opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She knew the consequences of defying him. She had seen it before. People who crossed him, who didn't know their place, were swiftly dealt with. But now, as she stood there, facing the man who had controlled her life for so long, Maria couldn't bring herself to be afraid. Her eyes flickered to the envelope in her hand. She could feel its weight, a burden that she had never expected to carry. The letter inside it held the truth, a truth that could change everything. She knew she couldn't just stand there and pretend nothing had happened, that she hadn't seen what she had seen. But she also knew that exposing it would put her in danger. There would be no turning back, but something inside Maria stirred. For so long she had been invisible, just another face, just another worker, silent and unseen. But this moment, this choice, was hers. She had the power to expose the lies, to bring the truth to light. It was a risk, but it was one she was willing to take. With a deep breath, Maria squared her shoulders and looked Mr. Donovan directly in the eyes. "I was just doing my job," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "I wasn't looking for anything, but I found something I think you should know about." Mr. Donovan's eyes narrowed. He took a step back, crossing his arms over his chest. "What are you talking about?" His voice was now laced with suspicion, his body tense, as if ready to strike at any moment. Maria felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but she didn't back down. She had come too far to turn away now. "The letter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The one on your desk, it's from the immigration office. It confirms the investigation into your business practices. You've been using illegal labor." For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Mr. Donovan's face drained of color, and his eyes flickered to the desk, his gaze locking on the envelope. Maria could see the flicker of panic in his eyes, but it was quickly masked by a cold mask of anger. "You think you can just waltz in here and accuse me of whatever this is?" Mr. Donovan hissed, his voice rising now, his anger spilling out. "You think you know anything about how this works? You're a maid, Maria, you clean. That's all you do?" Maria's breath hitched at the insult, but she refused to let it break her resolve. "I know enough," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "I know that what you're doing isn't right, and I know that I can't stay silent about it anymore." For a moment, Mr. Donovan said nothing. His face was a mask of anger, and his jaw clenched so tightly that Maria could see the muscles straining beneath the skin. The room seemed to close in on her, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest, but she held her ground. She had crossed the line, and there was no going back. Finally, Mr. Donovan spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into, Maria," he said, his eyes narrowing as he took a step toward her. "Do you think anyone will believe you? Do you really think your word will matter over mine?" Maria's heart raced, but she didn't flinch. "It doesn't matter if they believe me or not," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The truth will come out, it always does, and I'm not afraid of what will happen. I'm not afraid of you." Mr. Donovan's laugh was cold, almost cruel. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" he sneered. "You think you're doing something noble. You're nothing, Maria, you're just a maid, and no one will listen to you." Maria's stomach churned at his words, but she refused to let them break her. He was right about one thing, she wasn't a hero. She was just a woman who had had enough of being silenced, enough of being treated like she was less than human, enough of living in a world that saw her as nothing more than a tool to be used. "I don't need to be a hero," she said, her voice steady. "I just need to do what's right." Mr. Donovan took a step back, his face twisted with anger and disbelief. For a moment Maria thought he might lash out, but instead he turned sharply on his heel and stormed out of the room. She could hear his footsteps echoing down the hallway, his rage palpable, but she didn't move. She didn't even breathe. The silence in the room was deafening. Maria stood there for a long time, her mind racing. She had made the decision. She had exposed the truth, and now there was no turning back. But as the adrenaline began to fade, Maria was left with one thought. What now? What would happen to her? What would happen to the people who had been complicit in this lie? The story was out, but the battle was just beginning. She knew she had made enemies, powerful ones, and the consequences of her actions were still unknown. As she walked out of the room, she heard Mr. Donovan's voice in the distance, speaking to someone. His words were indistinct, but the anger in his tone was unmistakable. Maria didn't need to hear the rest. She had already made her decision, and now it was time to see it through. The tension was far from over, and Maria knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Would she be able to handle what was coming? Would she be able to survive the fallout from exposing a powerful man like Mr. Donovan? She didn't know. But she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't go back. She had done what was right, and that was enough. Maria's heart raced as she stepped away from the door, her legs unsteady beneath her. The hallway seemed longer than ever as she walked toward the stairs, her footsteps echoing against the polished floor. The weight of what she had just done hung heavily on her shoulders, each step feeling like a lifetime. She had crossed a line, one that could never be undone. She had spoken the truth to Mr. Donovan, had exposed his darkest secrets, and now she was left to face the unknown consequences of her actions. She didn't know what was going to happen next. Would Mr. Donovan retaliate? Would he fire her? Worse, would he make sure she never worked again, blacklisting her from every job she tried to get? The thought of losing her livelihood, of being left without a way to support herself, filled her with a cold fear. She wasn't just afraid for her job, she was afraid for her life. In that moment, Maria realized that what she had done was more than just standing up for herself. It was standing up to a system that had been in place for years, a system that had exploited people like her for far too long. The thought gnawed at her as she made her way to the back exit, hoping to leave the mansion undetected. She had to get out of there before things escalated further. The door creaked open, and she stepped out into the cool evening air, her mind racing. The city was quiet, the streets empty except for a few cars passing by, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Maria wrapped her arms around herself as she walked briskly down the alley, her breath coming in short bursts. It was then that she heard the footsteps behind her. Slow, measured, too deliberate to be a coincidence. Maria's heart skipped a beat. She turned her head slightly, her eyes scanning the street behind her. At first, she didn't see anyone, but then, just as she reached the end of the alley, she caught a glimpse of a figure in the shadows. A man. He was tall, his face obscured by the darkness, but the way he walked, purposeful, confident, told her that he wasn't just a passerby. She felt a chill run down her spine. She quickened her pace, her footsteps sounding louder now, but the man didn't stop following. Fear gripped her chest, her breath catching in her throat. Was it one of Mr. Donovan's associates? Had he sent someone to intimidate her, to warn her to stay quiet? Maria's mind raced, the possibility sending a wave of panic through her. She reached the corner of the street and glanced over her shoulder. The man was still there, closer now, and Maria could feel her pulse quicken with each step she took. She had to lose him. She had to find a way to get away before it was too late. But just as she turned the corner, she felt a hand grip her arm, pulling her back with surprising strength. "Maria," a voice growled, low and menacing. It wasn't Mr. Donovan's voice, but the words still made her blood run cold. "You've made a huge mistake." The man's grip tightened around her arm, and Maria struggled to break free. Her mind raced, trying to find a way out, but her body was frozen with fear. She had no idea what this man wanted or how far Mr. Donovan's influence stretched. But one thing was certain, she wasn't safe anymore. The man's grip was strong, and Maria could feel the power he exerted on her arm as he pulled her further into the darkness of the alley. She tried to twist away, but his hold was like iron. The tension in her muscles was growing unbearable, but the more she fought, the more the fear gripped her heart. The man's breath was hot against her ear, and he continued to whisper menacingly, "I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're not going to get away with it. You've exposed too much, and now you'll pay the price." His words echoed in her mind like a warning bell. The danger had never felt so close, so real. Maria had thought that standing up for what was right would bring change, would bring justice. But now, in the cold grip of this stranger's hand, she realized the cost might be greater than she had ever imagined. The man leaned in closer, his body close enough for Maria to feel his breath on her skin. She could hear the sinister promise in his voice as he continued, "You'll never work again. You'll be nothing more than a memory, a story people tell to scare others into staying in line. No one cares about a maid, Maria. You're just a nuisance." The words felt like a slap to the face. For the first time in a long time, Maria felt the weight of her position, the weight of her identity. She wasn't supposed to speak up, wasn't supposed to challenge the powers that had controlled her for so long. She was just a maid, after all. Her existence, in the eyes of people like this man, was disposable. She was nothing more than an object, an invisible cog in their machine. But despite the crushing weight of his words, Maria didn't feel defeated. Instead, something inside her began to stir. An ember of resolve, a quiet determination that began to grow stronger with every second. She wasn't going to let this man or anyone else erase her. She wasn't going to let fear win. Maria's pulse was racing, and the adrenaline surged through her body like fire. She didn't know how she was going to escape, but she knew one thing: she couldn't give up. With one last surge of strength, Maria twisted her body, trying to break free from the man's grip. She felt his fingers tighten, but she pushed harder, her fingers digging into the rough surface of the alley wall as she fought with everything she had. Her heart was pounding, her breath shallow and quick, but she refused to be held captive any longer. The fear was still there, gnawing at her, but she also felt a powerful surge of anger. Anger at being silenced for so long, anger at the injustice she had endured, anger at being reduced to nothing in the eyes of people who thought they could control her. With a final effort, Maria pushed the man's arm away, and for a split second, he stumbled backward. It was all the opportunity she needed. Without thinking, Maria turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay in that alley any longer. The man was still behind her, his footsteps echoing in the dark, but Maria pushed herself harder, her legs burning, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to outrun him. She had to escape. Every step felt like a battle, but she kept moving, driven by a single thought: I will not be silenced. Her mind raced with the possibilities of what would happen if he caught her, what would happen if she failed. But no matter how hard her heart pounded, No matter how close the danger seemed, Maria knew that she couldn't stop. She had come too far to let fear take control now. The alley seemed endless, the darkness closing in, but in that moment Maria found a strength she didn't know she had. She kept running, each step a defiance, a refusal to be put down again. Suddenly, there was a flash of movement ahead of her. Maria skidded to a stop just in time, her feet sliding on the slick pavement as she came face to face with another figure blocking her path. Her breath hitched in her throat. It was Mr. Donovan. His expression was cold, his face twisted in an angry, almost triumphant sneer. He stood in front of her, hands casually placed in his pockets as if he had all the time in the world, his posture relaxed despite the fact that he had just been chasing her. Maria's heart sank as she realized that this was the moment. There was no way out now. She was cornered, trapped. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the weight of the situation pressed on her chest like a heavy stone. Mr. Donovan's eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down, his mouth curling into a cruel smile. "You should have stayed quiet, Maria," he said, his voice calm but with an unmistakable edge of finality. "But now you've made this personal." Maria's breath caught in her throat. She had been so sure of her choices up until now, but standing in front of Mr. Donovan, her boss, her oppressor, she couldn't help but feel a wave of doubt wash over her. She was up against someone with power, someone who had built an empire on the backs of people like her. What chance did she have now? But despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her, something inside her refused to bend. She had already made the choice to speak the truth, to stand up for what was right. She had already put herself on the line, and there was no turning back. Maria stood her ground, her eyes meeting Mr. Donovan's with quiet defiance. She refused to let fear show, even though her heart was racing, even though every fiber of her being wanted to run. "You may have all the power in the world," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "But that doesn't make what you're doing right." Mr. Donovan's smile faltered, and for the first time Maria saw something flicker in his eyes, a hint of uncertainty. But it was quickly replaced by a cruel smirk, and he took a step closer to her. "You really think you can change anything?" he sneered. "You think one little maid can make a difference?" His words stung, but Maria stood tall, refusing to back down. "The truth will always come out," she said, her voice unwavering. "And no one can stop it, not even you." Mr. Donovan's eyes flickered with a mixture of anger and amusement. He stepped back, his gaze darkening as he assessed her, as if deciding whether or not she was worth his time. But Maria didn't flinch. She was done with being afraid, done with being intimidated. She had fought for too long to stay silent. And no matter what happened next, she knew she couldn't go back. She had taken the first step, now there was no turning back. The words hung in the air between them, a final challenge. But what would happen next? Would she make it out of this alive? Would her actions cost her everything, or would the truth be enough to tear down the empire Mr. Donovan had built? The story was far from over, and Maria knew it. The hardest part was yet to come. The next few days passed in a blur of uncertainty, each moment heavier than the last. Maria's mind was consumed with the consequences of her actions. She had exposed the truth, but what did that mean for her future? Her life was about to change, and not in the ways she had hoped. The mansion felt like a prison now, the walls closing in with every passing second. As Maria walked through the house, she could feel the stares of the other staff members, the way they looked at her with a mix of admiration and fear. Whispers followed her wherever she went. Some congratulated her, but many were too afraid to speak up. Maria had become a symbol of defiance, but she also knew that in doing so, she had made herself a target. The silence she had once lived in was no longer an option, and yet, it felt like the consequences of her bravery were slowly suffocating her. She couldn't stay in the mansion forever. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that her time there had come to an end. But even as she planned her exit, fear gnawed at her. What would Mr. Donovan do? He had the power to destroy her, to silence her, and he wasn't above using his resources to do so. With every decision she made, Maria felt the weight of the danger pressing down on her. She could hear the echoes of Mr. Donovan's threats in her mind, a constant reminder of the fight she had started but could not fully control. One evening, as she prepared to leave the mansion for good, Maria found herself walking down the grand staircase one last time. The house, once so familiar, now felt foreign and oppressive. Each step she took was heavier than the last, each glance she gave to the walls a reminder of all that had happened there. The mansion's grandeur seemed to mock her, the wealth and power it represented a direct contrast to the life she had lived within its walls. But Maria didn't stop. She wasn't going to let it control her any longer. With her head held high, she stepped out into the cool evening air, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders but refusing to let it break her. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She was done being invisible. She had made her stand, and now the world would have to listen. The silence of the night was broken only by the sound of her footsteps echoing against the cold pavement as she made her way down the street. But then, just as the city lights flickered overhead, a shadow moved across her path, blocking her way. Maria's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the figure standing before her, Mr. Donovan. His face was twisted with anger, his eyes cold and calculating. He was dressed in his usual sharp suit, his posture relaxed, as if the power he wielded gave him control over everything, even the very streets she walked. "You should have stayed quiet, Maria," he said, his voice calm but dripping with malice. The words hit her like a punch to the gut, and for a moment Maria felt the weight of everything she had done crash down on her. She had thought she was doing the right thing, but now, standing before him, she wasn't so sure. Fear crept up her spine, but she pushed it away, standing tall despite the overwhelming sense of dread. "I didn't do this for me," she replied, her voice shaking but resolute. "I did this because it's the right thing to do. You can threaten me all you want, but you won't stop the truth. People will know what you've done. And that's something you can't take away." Mr. Donovan's eyes flickered with something between anger and amusement. "You really think you can change anything?" he sneered. "You're just a maid. Who's going to believe you?" The contempt in his voice was palpable, and for a moment Maria questioned herself. But she knew this was the moment she had to stand firm. "The truth will always come out," Maria said, her voice growing stronger, a fire igniting within her that had been there all along. "And no one can stop it, not even you." For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with the tension between them, and Maria could feel the weight of the confrontation settling over her. She had exposed his lies. She had spoken the truth, and now there was no turning back. Would it cost her everything? Would she lose it all for standing up to a man like Mr. Donovan? But no matter what happened next, Maria knew one thing: she would never back down. The fight wasn't just about her. It was about the truth, about exposing the systems of power that had been built on the backs of people like her. She wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had been replaced by a fierce determination to make sure the truth was heard, no matter the cost. Mr. Donovan's laughter echoed in the air, but it didn't deter Maria. She wasn't going to let him win. The truth was already out. The lies he had built his empire on were no longer a secret. He may have tried to silence her, but she had already spoken. And even if he tried to crush her, he couldn't take away what she had done. As the words hung in the air, Maria turned and walked away. Each step felt like a victory, but it was a quiet one. The world around her had changed, but she knew that the hardest part was still ahead. The truth had been revealed, but the battle for justice wasn't over. She had taken the first step, but there were many more to come. Maria walked away from the confrontation, her figure framed against the alley's dim light. She kept her head held high, her eyes focused forward. The danger was still present, the fight far from over, but Maria wasn't afraid anymore. She had chosen her path, and no matter what happened next, she knew she had done the right thing. The shadows of the alley seemed to fade behind her as she made her way into the unknown, but with each step, Maria knew that she was leaving behind more than just a life of silence. She was leaving behind fear, doubt, and invisibility. She was stepping into a new life, a life where she had a voice, one that could never be silenced again. The days following Maria's confrontation with Mr. Donovan were filled with uncertainty, but they also brought with them something unexpected, a wave of solidarity. The media had caught wind of the story, and soon, Maria became the face of a larger movement, one that spoke out against the exploitation of workers and the systems of power that allowed such abuse to continue unchecked. Maria stood at the front of a large rally for workers' rights, speaking into a microphone, her voice strong and steady. The crowd around her was diverse, a mixture of people from all walks of life, each of them standing in support of the same cause. They held signs demanding equality and justice, and their voices rose in unison, chanting for a change that had been long overdue. In that moment, Maria realized that she had started something much bigger than herself. She had given a voice to those who had been silenced, and in doing so she had found her own. The movement had begun, and it was unstoppable. "All it takes is one person to stand up," Maria said into the microphone, her voice growing stronger with each word. "One person to say enough is enough, and once that happens, the truth starts to spread. It becomes unstoppable. We are stronger than they ever thought we could be." And we won't stop until we have what we deserve: equality, respect, and dignity for every person, no matter who they are or where they come from. The crowd erupted into applause, their clapping filling the air with the sound of unity. Maria's heart swelled with pride as she looked out at the faces around her. Faces filled with hope, determination, and the belief that they could change the world. But even as she stood there, basking in the victory of this moment, Maria knew that the fight wasn't over. There was still so much to be done. The systems of inequality were still deeply entrenched, and it would take time to dismantle them. But in that moment, Maria felt a sense of power she had never known before. She had sparked a movement, and together they would fight for the justice they deserved. Later that day, Maria found herself sitting in a small cafe, the sun streaming through the window, casting a warm glow over her face. She gazed out the window, lost in thought, reflecting on everything that had happened. The journey she had been on had been long and painful, but it had brought her to this moment, a moment of clarity and purpose. Her hands rested on the table in front of her, and as she looked out at the bustling street, she realized that her journey was far from over. There was still so much work to be done, so many people still suffering in silence, but Maria knew that she wasn't alone anymore. She had given others the courage to speak out, to stand up against the systems that had oppressed them for so long. She had made a difference. She had proven that even in a world that tried to keep people like her invisible, the truth could rise to the surface. And when it did, there was no stopping it. But as she sat there, reflecting on all she had accomplished, one question lingered in her mind. How many more people need to stand up before the world truly listens? How many more lives will be affected by systems of inequality before we all demand real change? Maria didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to stop fighting until the world was ready to listen. The journey wasn't over, but it had started, and that was enough.